Is Ferrari's problem really Hamilton, or has Frédéric Vasseur just revealed something much more serious after the Japanese GP? Subscribe to continue uploading more of this type of content now, if we continue. Because while many point to Lewis Hamilton's discreet result, within the team they are talking about something completely different. A car that does not respond, a driver without confidence, and a message that changes the entire narrative. What is really happening inside Ferrari? And why could this be the beginning of a crisis much bigger than it seems? The Japanese Grand Prix was not just another race on the calendar. It was the exact moment where Ferrari stopped hiding its weaknesses and where everything began to fall into place in a worrying way. Because what we saw in Suzuka was not just a discrete result. It was confirmation that the current project has deep cracks that can no longer be covered up. From the beginning of the weekend, the sensations were not the best, and although from the outside one could think that it was a problem of adaptation or even punctual performance, the reality was much more complex because Hamilton had already been warning of something that within the team they knew, but did not want to admit publicly. The car did not transmit confidence, and in Formula One, that is everything. Hamilton qualified in a position that already marked the car's real limit, far from pole, and with no real margin to fight for the first positions, which made it clear that the SF26 had a significant deficit in pure performance. But the most revealing thing was not the position itself, but the difference, because being almost 8/10 behind on a circuit like Suzuka is not a minor detail. It is a clear sign that there is something that is not working as it should. Even so, the race offered an opportunity to reverse the situation, as Ferrari has shown to have a more solid pace in long runs, and at times it seemed that Hamilton could get into the fight for the podium, closing in on the leading drivers and showing glimpses of the potential that the car does have in certain conditions. But that illusion was short-lived, because as the laps progressed, the SF26 limitations reappeared, especially when the rivals' pace began to intensify. Mercedes and McLaren stepped up, and Ferrari simply couldn't respond, getting stuck in a middle zone where it wasn't fast enough to attack, but also not solid enough to defend with authority. It was in that context that one of the most symbolic moments of the race occurred, when Charles Leclerc overtook Hamilton on the track, an aggressive maneuver that not only defined positions, but also left a clear reading. Within the same car, whoever was more confident could make the difference. And this is where everything starts to take shape, because what we saw in Japan was not an isolated problem. It was the direct consequence of a car that has a very limited operating window, that depends too much on specific conditions, and that does not allow the drivers to exploit their maximum potential consistently. This explains why Hamilton could seem competitive at certain times, but disappeared at others, and also why his later statements did not point to his own errors, but rather to a lack of general performance of the car. Ferrari tried to maintain the narrative that the performance was there, and that only small adjustments were needed. But the reality is that Suzuka exposed something much deeper, because when a team cannot keep pace with its main competitors on a circuit as complete as this, the problem is not circumstantial, it is structural. And that is precisely what makes this Grand Prix a turning point, because from here on it is no longer about improving details, but rather about understanding if the car concept is really competitive, or if it needs a much more in-depth review. This is the scenario in which Vasseur's message appears, but before understanding its real impact, we must fully understand what Ferrari revealed in Japan, because only then can we interpret why his words are not just an endorsement of Hamilton, but a statement that could set the team's course for the remainder of the season. The true impact of Frédéric Vasseur's message is not understood if what is happening internally at Ferrari is not analyzed, because this is where the story takes a key turn, going from a simple bad result to a much more delicate situation on a technical and structural level. What Vasseur does after the Japanese GP is not only to protect Lewis Hamilton, it is to completely redirect the narrative towards a real origin of the problem. And that in Formula One is a very calculated move, because it involves publicly assuming that the SF26 is not meeting expectations, something that Ferrari always tries to avoid until the last moment. When Vasseur claims that they are pushing hard in all areas to close the gap, he is hinting that the problem is not limited to a single aspect of car, but affects the entire package, from aerodynamic balance to energy management to the ability to extract performance in qualifying. This point is fundamental because it breaks the typical narrative of lack of driver adaptation and places the focus directly on the car, which automatically changes the perception both inside and outside the team. It is no longer a question of whether Hamilton is performing or not, but rather whether Ferrari is giving him the necessary tools to compete. And this is where the message takes on a much deeper second layer, because by so clearly backing Hamilton, Vasseur is also sending an internal signal to Maranello, a kind of strategic protection to prevent the pressure from falling on the driver, and diverting him from the real problem. This is especially important in an environment like Ferrari, where historically criticism tends to quickly focus on drivers when results are not forthcoming. In this case, Vasseur nips that narrative in the bud and draws a clear line. The problem is technical, not human. However, this movement also has consequences because by implicitly recognizing that the car has limitations, Ferrari places itself in a position of urgency, where small improvements or setup adjustments are no longer enough, but rather a more aggressive evolution of the car is needed. And this is not easy because we are talking about a car that, as already seen in Japan, has a very narrow performance window, which means that any change must be extremely precise so as not to worsen other areas. These types of problems are usually tied to deeper design concepts, which further complicates the short-term solution. Furthermore, there is a key element that cannot be ignored, and that is the difference between qualifying and race performance. Ferrari has shown that it can be competitive in long runs, but it fails at the most critical moment of the weekend, which is when the grid is defined. This completely conditions the strategy, forces the drivers to risk more in the race, and exposes them to situations like the one Hamilton experienced in Suzuka, where even having pace, he could not capitalize on it due to the starting position and the limitations of the car at key moments. In this context, Hamilton plays a much more important role than many imagine, because his experience not only serves to compete, but to diagnose problems. Your feedback about the lack of confidence in the car is not a simple feeling. It is a development tool that Ferrari needs to interpret correctly if it wants to evolve the SF26. And this is where Vasseur's message makes even more sense, because by supporting Hamilton, he's also validating his diagnosis, which implies that the team internally recognizes that there are real flaws in the car's behavior. But all this brings us to an even more critical issue, and that is time. Because in today's Formula One, reacting late can mean losing the entire season. While Mercedes and McLaren seem to have taken firm steps forward, Ferrari finds itself in a situation where it needs quick responses, but with no room for error. And that is precisely the point where this message stops being reassuring and becomes an alarm signal, because when a team admits that it is working in all areas, it is also recognizing that the problem is bigger than expected. Thus, what began as a simple reaction after a result in Japan becomes something much more significant, a confirmation that Ferrari is in the midst of an internal struggle to understand its own car, and that Hamilton, far from being the problem, is a key piece in the search for solutions. And with this on the table, the big question is no longer what happened in Suzuka, but what Ferrari is going to do from now on to prevent this situation from becoming a much bigger crisis. The Japanese Grand Prix not only left a discreet result for Ferrari, it left a warning, and Vasseur's message, far from putting out the fire, confirms that the team is entering a critical phase where there is no longer room to hide weaknesses or to make excuses. Because when a team manager comes out publicly to support his driver in that way, what he is really doing is recognizing that the problem is much deeper, and that the situation needs an immediate reaction if they do not want the season to slip away permanently. This is where everything converges, because what we saw in Suzuka is not an isolated case. It is the consequence of a trend that has been dragging on since the beginning of the project, a car that has flashes of performance but is not able to sustain them, that depends too much on specific conditions, and that, above all, does not allow a driver like Hamilton to exploit his maximum level. And when a 7-time world champion cannot make a difference, the problem stops being individual and becomes structural. Something that at Ferrari has always been difficult to accept, but that now seems inevitable. Vasseur's message therefore marks a turning point because it completely redefines the narrative within the team. Hamilton is no longer the focus of doubt. He is the thermometer that is showing that something is not working, and that changes everything. From now on, every race, every session, and every update to the SF26 is going to be under enormous pressure, because Ferrari has already implicitly recognized that it needs to improve in multiple areas, and that doesn't happen overnight. The urgency is real, and time is against it. Hamilton, far from being the problem, has become the most obvious proof of this situation, because if a driver of his caliber cannot find confidence in the car, it is not a question of adaptation. It is a clear sign that there is something that is not working at the base of the project. And this is where Ferrari faces its biggest challenge, not just improving performance, but really understanding what is going wrong before it is too late. The Japanese GP was not just another race. It was the moment where Ferrari stopped being able to hide, where doubts became certainties, and where the team itself, through its boss, confirmed what many already suspected. Now the pressure is total, because every decision from this point on will define whether this story becomes a comeback or another chapter of frustration. And with all this on the table, the big question is no longer what's wrong with Hamilton, but whether Ferrari is prepared to do what it really needs: change course before this season completely slips away from them. If you want, the next step is to expand the first block, because there is the key to the entire story and where the most important details that explain this problem from its origin are hidden. Subscribe to continue uploading more of that content. Now you really think about all this.